Well, good morning and welcome to TLC Live. I'm in studio not with Andrea Gomez, who's out on assignment, but with former United States Ambassador Chase Untermeyer. He has held positions at all four levels of government: local, state, national, and international, over a period of more than 40 years, with work in journalism, academia, and business as well. A 1968 graduate of Harvard College, he served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. He was a Texas state representative, an assistant secretary of the Navy under President Reagan, director of presidential personnel, and director of the Voice of America under the first President Bush, and U.S. ambassador to Qatar under the second President Bush. He is currently professor of practice at Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston, my alma mater. Ambassador Untermeyer is the author of 3 volumes of diary-based memoirs of Reagan-Bush era and the book How Important People Act. And it's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Untermeyer.
Thank you so much.
It's good to be with you, you're never going to fill Andrea's shoes, but we'll do the best we can, right?
Exactly.
Well, thanks for coming in. As I mentioned to you on the phone when I invited you over, I wanted to visit with you. First of all, I believe that you're one of the best historians. I love to listen to you and read your books. But there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. As you know, I travel the state of Texas talking to a lot of Republican county parties, Republican women, pachyderm clubs, candidates running for office. And one of the things I try to emphasize is how to broaden our party, how to be more inclusive on these great ideals about, free markets and liberty and the Constitution and representative government and our Republican form of government. And to do that, I remind people of the storied history of the Republican Party. I started, even I as a longtime Republican, and, I say long time, 1992, I tried to be in your shoes. I was a nominee for the Texas House of Representatives. But I started doing a little research about the Republican Party and learned that it was formed in the 1800s in Wisconsin for the sole purpose, really, of combating slavery, an institution that has not is not particularly a proud moment in American history. And over the years, as I started researching, realized not only did we have the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, which incidentally was read in Galveston, Texas on Juneteenth, but we also were instrumental in passing both the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. We had a Republican who integrated Major League Baseball. Republicans have a storied history of fighting for the underprivileged and those that are abused and not benefiting from all of the ideals in the Constitution. So let's talk about a little bit about the history of the Republican Party and how we can broaden it.
Well, I'm very much in favor of broadening the party, but you have to want to broaden the party before you broaden it. And I'm not so sure that many people believe in that these days. They sort of have the idea that if they at least are active and they at least vote and show up in elections, that they can keep on winning, even though the demographics of the Republican Party, which is another way of saying older white people, is shrinking, particularly in Texas, such that that should be a concern, you'd think, for people who want to keep on winning elections. But they still cling to this notion that if the vote can just be kept small enough, that they will constitute a majority. I disagree with that, plus the fact that I've heard throughout my political life all kinds of warnings from Republican sages who say, oh, if we do away with the poll tax, the Republican Party will never win an election. Or if we do away with or if we have absentee voting, or we have mail-in voting, that will do away with the Republican Party. There was something called motor voter, which basically meant that if you went to sign up to get a driver's license, that the clerk was required to say, and would you like to vote? There were people who thought that would be the end of the Republican Party. Well, we've gone through all of those things, and the Republican Party is still around and still winning major elections, occasionally the presidency and occasionally the Congress. So that's why I am less worried by these facts of demography. That if you're a party that has something to say and you have attractive candidates who say it well, you can keep on winning elections. And people who, on the other side, say the Republican Party is trying to suppress elections, my critique of that argument is that the various laws that have been passed in recent years on voter identification and restrictions with regard to when and how people can vote before elections clearly are not meant to broaden the electorate. But at the same time, they aren't oppression in the sense of having armed people at the polls who are keeping certain voters away from the polls. That's oppression. Mm-hmm. That's what totalitarian governments do. Mm-hmm. These laws I might not have voted for if I were in the legislature, but they are, at least to be fair, pulling back the expansion of voting opportunities that have existed over time. And let me make a final point here. There are those people who want to expand the possibilities and the ease of voting on the basic democratic grounds we heard going back to high school, that more people vote, the better. And yet, somehow, with all of these expansions that we've talked about, the electorate still seems to be about the same. So these broadenings and these restrictions, so far as I can tell, really don't have much impact.
Yeah, one of the comments I make is that we need to, conservatives and the Republican Party need to have marketable ideas that work all across America. Here in Texas, Ambassador, I think any student of politics would realize that we've lost most urban Texas, the Republican Party has. You look at Harris County, for example, one of the most diverse counties in the nation, where Republicans used to win by a margin of well over 50,000 votes back when I served as county treasurer.
And more.
Yeah. To be decimated in 2018 by a margin of 120,000 plus votes. That was quite a gap. Now, we've started to narrow that. The last county elections, there were a handful of judges that won at the bottom of the ticket, but most candidates that did not prevail lost by a narrow margin of about 6,000 votes. So we've narrowed the margin. But I tell Republicans all the time that you have to apply conservative solutions to urban problems. And it's very difficult to get them to focus on that. For example, one of the things that I have heard about in media but never really witnessed was what they call food deserts and healthcare deserts. And you don't have to go far here in Houston, for example, that you go some of the ethnic communities like the Fifth Ward, there are no grocery stores. And one of the issues that I've been trying to get at the state level anyway to focus on is the health of Texans. One of the biggest problems we face is childhood obesity, which leads to type 2 diabetes, which is expensive on the healthcare system, untreated and undiagnosed. And for example, a grandmother that may be getting dizzy and has a lot of thirst and wants to see an endocrinologist in the Fifth Ward, you got to take 2 buses and then transfer to the Red Line, go see the doctor who will write you a prescription. Then you got to take the Red Line and 2 buses back home. Then you got to go to a pharmacy, which there are none in her neighborhood. It's tough. It's tough. So I always say, why don't we apply conservative principles to urban problems, show Texans that we care about them, and that improves the image and actually resolves issues.
Well, you're absolutely right that issues like hunger and health should not be partisan issues. Maybe the solutions to those questions have partisan approaches, whereby liberals and Democrats in general may favor a state solution, and conservatives and Republicans in general might look around for private sector solutions. But everybody should be in favor of people being in the best of health. And you gave a very powerful argument why conservatives in particular should be concerned, and that is without proper health care, people are going to wind up being very, very expensive wards of the state, requiring ever greater amounts of money. And we're talking about, in this instance, citizens. You don't have to put up alarms about people coming in from other countries to take advantage of our welfare system. Just those people who are clearly born citizens will demand greater and need greater services that will be ever more expensive.
And the same thing with education. If you look at the huge urban school districts like the Houston Independent School District, this is an interesting debate that we're having in Austin. They Republicans believe vouchers and broadening charter schools and choice for parents will improve the situation. One of my concerns, of course, is those are all good ideas, but sometimes I wonder if we were going to create a two-tiered education system where legacy families that I, for example, am the first one in my family to go through college. My parents didn't know anything about the ACT, the SAT, writing college admissions essays. They couldn't afford a counselor to help me work and prepare for the SAT. Those are huge challenges for low-income families who no one's been through college. On the other hand, you have legacy families who mom and dad graduated from A&M and UT, and they work hard to get the best education. So they'll pick the best schools for their kids under a choice system. But I'm afraid that the rest of the society is left behind, and that's a problem.
Once again, this is an issue that shouldn't be partisan. At least the ultimate aim is to have a well-prepared, well-informed citizenry, people to fill jobs, so that, let's say, a small business person who might consider himself, herself, to be a staunch conservative and therefore might bridle at calls for more money on things like public education, realize that they need a workforce, and they need a workforce that can read and do numbers and be there on time and all those desirable things that a good educational system helps prepare people to do. Mm-hmm. So we all have a stake in the ultimate result of the educational system, and in particular, if most of our people are coming from less privileged neighborhoods, they depend upon the public education system to get that education.
Mm-hmm. One of getting back to Republican politics, I believe there was a article in last week. I believe it was published about the 6 types of Republicans in the Republican Party.
6.
Yes, they identified traditional Republicans, libertarian Republicans, right-wing Republicans, and they were talking about exactly what you mentioned, the ever-shrinking electorate, right, that chooses the Republican nominees. Most of the primaries are dominated by the far right of the Republican Party. How do you encourage more diverse views in primaries?
Well, let's start with the politicians themselves. And I used to be one, so I'm talking about me as much as I am today's to politicians. And that is, people say that in America we don't look to the long term meaning more than 4 years or maybe 6 years. The fact is that every politician is only concerned about what's coming up for him or her. And I doubt that even our senior leaders spend very much time thinking about the future of the Republican Party. They're thinking about their future and their next time on the ballot and in view of the public. Now, these things are not in conflict. The re-election of an incumbent at whatever level on the ballot that is helps build a party, helps maintain a party, helps employ people, helps create a sense of brand. All those things are desirable. But perhaps if we can get at least a bit of mind share of our politicians, our elected officials, as to what it takes to govern Texas and govern the United States, we can do so in a way that tries to attract people rather than to chop people off and to, even worse, make them the enemy. I have to admit that it's a tactic that is widely used today, the demonization of the other side. And that's unattractive. It's not unknown in our politics. People who today say Americans have never been more divided than they are today, and our politics are so polarized. frankly don't know their history. And to know that Americans have been divided, polarized, however you want to define it, since even before the revolution. We're just a big, diverse country with many, many chains of thought. If there are 6 Republican parties, that's 2 or 3 times more than I thought there were, but it just makes that point that we are, by nature, a diverse people. We will have disputes, and some of those disputes will be major, that will divide the country.
I think at one time when I got heavily involved in Republican politics, I do remember, I guess it was Lee Atwater. Was he the chairman of the Republican Party at one time? And didn't he have a theory called the Big Tent Theory, where we wanted everyone to participate? We wanted to expound and expose all political views, and then it was through the creation of the platform through the grassroots that the best ideas would percolate up, and that would be the platform of the Republican Party. And I remember at one time, even during the Reagan election, they were looking for what was called the silent majority, right? The evangelical Christians that felt that they didn't have a voice, and they came in masses. I think there was a young man, what was his name? Ralph Reed, that mobilized quite well evangelicals, and they swarmed in and helped Reagan get elected. Is that my correct recollection?
The only thing I would say from a historical point of view is the phrase silent majority actually began in the Nixon era. A view that he had, which in effect came together in the Reagan years, was that there was a large segment of middle income America who felt left out, who felt, harmed, and certainly they felt ignored and reviled by elites. So Nixon had the notion that these people could become Republicans, or at the very least vote for him, and they did. His re-election year against George McGovern perfectly framed that, in which Nixon got the breadth of middle-income America, and McGovern got the elites at Berkeley and Harvard, and that was about it. So the silent majority notion that Nixon had was, harmed by Watergate, and took Ronald Reagan to mobilize it. And that's when evangelical Christians, when Southerners, when blue-collar Americans began to realize that the Republican Party was more their home than the Democratic Party.
And have we strayed from that? It seems to me one of the key attractions to former President Trump was that I think he sort of adopted a populist view, and a view of talking more to the middle class Americans that had over the years felt that their manufacturing jobs had been shipped overseas. I think he talked about securing the border and Mexico building the wall, that sort of understanding that, we had this insatiable appetite for cheap labor in this country, and they were just swarming the border and coming in. But didn't Trump actually resonate with that crowd, the blue-collar, hardworking, kind of felt like, America had left them behind?
He did, and he does. That remains the core of his support group. The difference, I would say, is that the Trump politics appealing to that group is a politics of resentment, of having dangerous enemies who must be not just defeated but destroyed. That's different from the Reagan-era notion, the big tent appeal, which was more positive, more optimistic, more inclusive. Now, there are those today in the Trump base who view that as old-fashioned, unsuccessful politics. These, I suppose, are the people they would now call rhinos, Republicans in name only. But all I can say is the Reagan appeal worked, that he himself was personally popular, that the country advanced under his leadership, and it pays off when a country runs into trouble. Now, we didn't have that much trouble when Reagan was president, but I think of the day in 1986 that the Challenger space shuttle blew up. A terrible blow to Americans. It probably was the worst blow to our national psyche in between the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the attacks of September 11th, 2001. When that happened, Reagan was able to bring the country together. He was our national father, and he gave us hope and confidence that we would recover from this tragedy, go on to do great things, which we did. And that, to me, is what a president should do. But if a president appeals to resentments and the idea that you are where you are because there are people who hate you, people who look down on you, people who laugh at you, people who consider you deplorables, that may be very successful from a political formula basis, but it isn't what a nation needs in order to move ahead.
I often say, Ambassador, my observation is that Donald Trump, the phenomenon of Donald Trump, he was a donor to both parties at one time, but he really wasn't a politician. It's not like he worked his way up from City Hall in New York up to a state representative, maybe to the New York senator, and then congressman, and then he didn't have the usual trajectory. But it's amazing to me how he appealed to, particularly in South Texas, to a lot of the Hispanics. How do you reconcile those? That on the one hand, he wants to create a boogeyman and sort of be divisive. On the other hand, he somewhat broadened the party and brought in a lot of Latinos in Texas and across the country.
Well, you're better able to speak to that than I. I would say that the reason Donald Trump became president is because, speaking to the audience he addressed, he was able to steal a march on the Democrats who frankly didn't think that Hillary Clinton needed to campaign in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, that those were such solidly Democratic states because of the tradition of blue-collar workers voting Democratic, that they could concentrate elsewhere. Well, he got elected, meaning he won the Electoral College and the presidency by capturing those states that hadn't voted Republican since the days of George H.W. Bush. And that's why he became president. He identified that group. Perhaps there are parallels in South Texas that you could see, but in his case, he very brilliantly saw the opportunity, or as people say, he went hunting where the ducks were.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I always say is that Donald Trump, in my opinion, is a product, and some people will get upset, but I say this not with any disrespect, but Donald Trump was a product of the failures of the Republican Party. Too often, Republicans talked about fiscal conservatism, and yet we've had instances where we've had the executive branch and we have dominated the Congress. Congress controls the purse strings, and we've run up the national debt and the deficit. Republicans have latched onto this idea that you can cut taxes and increase benefits, entitlements. But how do you do that? I just don't know of any magical formula where those can be reconciled to produce solid fiscal budgets and solid fiscal footing for the future. And that puts us in a situation where we have to go borrow money through issuing bonds. Of course, we all know that China buys a substantial amount of our debt. But Republicans had opportunities. I think about this one, Ambassador. I'd like to hear your opinion. We knew some time ago that Americans were struggling with healthcare costs, that it was tragic stories that were often in the news about Americans that had to sell their most precious assets, which were their real estate holdings, to pay for cancer care or a heart transplant or a valve replacement. They didn't have insurance. As the economy went bad, people lost their health benefits. We knew there was a crisis. And in steps the Democrats, and they come up with a solidly partisan solution that Republicans opposed. But we had an opportunity to fix that. We've had an opportunity to address the budget, to talk to Americans and explain to them the perils of having high credit card debt, which is what bonds are. But we haven't done it. And so here comes Donald Trump and he starts talking about the issues: the swamp, jobs to China, abandoning the middle class, the border, all those things. So I often say that the Trump was a creation of the failures of the Republican Party.
He certainly identified the problems and articulated those very well. Might not have chosen the same word, but in his inaugural address, he spoke of how devastated the country was in reaction to those policies. But you mentioned healthcare. I remember sitting at many a breakfast, luncheon, other political gathering in the time between 2011 or 2010 when Barack Obama passed his healthcare solution, and 2016 when Donald Trump was elected. And the phrase was repeal and replace. So we had 6 years to come up with a replacement for Obamacare if we didn't like it. Now, I didn't volunteer. I still don't volunteer to be on the committee to come up with that replacement. But there are all kinds of very smart Republican staffers on Capitol Hill and in think tanks in Washington who looked into health care. And they could have, but didn't, come up with the replacement. So all the focus of the early Trump years, when the Republicans controlled not just the White House, but the House and Senate, was really repeal. And the anger was focused on the late Senator John McCain because he, in one vote, stopped the repeal of Obamacare. But let us not forget that there was no replacement on the table ready to go in the event McCain had voted to otherwise. In fact, my guess is if there had been a replacement, he would have voted for that.
Yeah, and we keep repeating the mistakes. One of the major issues, at least in Texas, not nationally, but right, because I saw a poll this morning that said right now the trend in the polls is the economy. I've always said that if Trump is the nominee and the economy falters in November of 2024, all Trump has to do, if he can zip his lips, is go to do one debate with Joe Biden and look in the camera as Ronald Reagan did to Jimmy Carter and say, "You're better off today than you were 4 years ago." End of story. Because the Americans vote their pocketbooks. But getting back to issues that the Republicans can lead on, here in Texas, for example, immigration. There was a tragic death of a young lady, I think 3 years old, transported between Texas and Chicago, who passed away in the bus the other day. Had it been Trump or a Republican, the media would have been all over us as, putting children in cages and denying them medical care. And, there was a young 14-year-old who was working at a meatpacking plant in Mississippi about 4 weeks ago who was late at night, slipped and fell into some heavy equipment, and it was killed. The Department of Labor has replete records of young, undocumented children working at meatpacking plants and agricultural industry. But it's all under the Biden administration, so it's okay. But Republicans should apply, again, a conservative principle, solutions. And I'm reminded in 1986 that Ronald Reagan signed what we now call amnesty, where millions of undocumented aliens became U.S. citizens, and many of them Republicans. So thankful to Ronald Reagan. To this day, I see them. They're proud Americans. They vote Republican. So I look at the immigration system and I say, God, it's such an easy fix. Rather than allowing the 2.5 or 3 million people to just cross the border illegally, why don't we just issue 2.5 million work visas, document folks, and they can come here legally and work and go back home?
I fully agree.
That's not a complicated solution.
No, my analysis is that both political parties recognize that, yes, the immigration issue could be addressed. I'm not sure solved is the right verb, but it could at least be addressed as it was in 1986, and we could live with that for a certain number of years. And that's because both parties will say that we need to control the border for security reasons. And both parties will say we need the labor to fix roofs and cut grass and wash dishes and do other things as people work their way up to prosperity in the American system. But neither party wants to address the immigration issue because it is too delicious an issue to grab and beat up the opposition.
Okay. Now, let me tell you what I think. By not addressing the immigration issue, in my opinion now, we have, it's estimated, between 15 to 20 plus million undocumented aliens, mostly in urban areas. Houston, as you know, is home to many undocumented aliens, the bulk of which are Hispanic from the Americas. I mean, I know we get Chinese and we get Russians and Ukrainians coming across, but the bulk are Hispanic. And so what we're doing in this country, Ambassador, is creating what I call a permanent underclass of people that don't have a voice. Now, I understand they can't vote because of their legal status, but they do pay taxes. And so you have a city like Houston and many other cities in America where you have now not the majority, but a plurality of the population is of a certain ethnic group. Hispanics in Houston, 43% of Houston is Hispanics. But you look at the political representation, Hispanics are absent at the city hall. They've never elected a mayor. We've had a couple of Hispanic at-large members. By and large, those are gone. We have 11 district seats. Only one Hispanic fills that. Yeah. So my concern about this undocumented population coming across and not having a policy that we can control is that we are building a permanent underclass.
And let me expand on that by a reflection on a part of the world quite unlike ours where I lived, and that was the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. Very wealthy places there that we all know of: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. These are places that have very, very tiny citizenries and very large numbers of people who are there as contract workers. They're the ones who make those places function, from the highest level of professional jobs of one sort or another in healthcare and energy, all the way down to the people who are filling holes in the street. Those societies keep on going because they're very, very wealthy, but they create these states in which a vast majority of these countries are not citizens and never will be citizens. And it seems to me that is a formula for the long term of a very dangerous and difficult circumstance, because what you want in any society, particularly a nation, is giving everybody a sense that they have a stake in the future of that country and the future together, that they are not divided by class, by economic circumstance, whatever. Now, the United States is not as bad in this as the Persian Gulf countries I mentioned, but your observation is quite apt that there is a large part of America, and possibly a large growing part of America, that will be separated from responsibility for the future of the nation.
Approaching 10% of the population.
And that's not healthy.
Not at all.
It's not deadly yet for our society, but it's not a healthy formula.
Let's shift gears. We're down to 10 minutes. I thought we'd go for half an hour, but I guess we've gone a little longer. Civility in politics. We started the conversation by saying that politics, we've always been divided in America politically. You know, we have the Whig Party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party. You know, we had the Communist Party, but that's nothing new. When I go around the state talking to Republicans, I say, you know, one of the things I'm struck by is going to Arlington National Cemetery, and the headstones often have crosses. They have Stars of David. They have crescent moons. And probably half of the burial grounds are Republicans and the other half probably Democrats. At Pearl Harbor, I'm sure there were a lot of Democrats that were killed on those ships. So I believe that inside Washington, inside the Beltway, it's become a civil war. it's who can impeach whom. How can we play gotcha politics rather than solving the issues facing Americans? You've spent time in Washington in the executive branch. You're a student of national politics. Do you see it that way?
I don't see it as a civil war, but clearly there is a high level of rancor in the country. To give a political reflection, when I hear people say we've never been as divided as we are, I often ask people, well, when were we united to the degree that you want
Post
us
9/11?
to be? Well, there was that moment. But for a sustained period of time,
Right.
People might think of World War II. And yes, the United States, all people were united in wanting to defeat the Nazis and the other Axis powers. But politics was not suspended during the 1940s. There were some very bitter disputes at that time. There were some pretty awful race riots, one not too far from here in Beaumont, Texas, another in Detroit, and some other communities. There was a big fight, a very interesting fight, given our current disputes over elections, over whether the soldiers who were fighting for democracy in places like Guadalcanal and Anzio could vote for president. There was big division at that time. So World War II was a time of unity, but it also reflected division. The difference was that in past years, there was at least a sense of common purpose that led Democrats and Republicans to work together on certain overwhelming issues. You mentioned earlier how, in many ways, the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s were enacted because of Republicans, mostly Middle Western, Northern Republicans who believed in civil rights and were willing to join with Democrats, also from the North and the Great Lakes area and the far West, who believed the same way. And that was important as a step forward in the development of America. We've come together on other issues in the past, and there are still cases today, they just don't get reported, where there is bipartisanship. But we have moved past the point that it used to be when Ronald Reagan would have fights during the day with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House.
Scotch at night?
And then they would get together in the evening and have drinks and tell Irish stories. That we're missing. But I believe that what people mess up, people can correct. So all it takes is a change of attitude on the part of the American people. This is not an egg that is scrambled and cannot be put back together again. All it takes are individuals running for office like president, but also Congress, state legislature, city council, who are willing to be open to the other side. There's that prayer that we've heard many times, Lord, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. Well, let there be bipartisanship and let it begin with me. Somebody has got to reach out to the other side.
Well, and then we go back to what we started with. Then you have to fear a primary challenge, and the primaries are dominated by the right wing of the party.
Well, the fear may be there,
Yeah.
but I will give a lesson in politics from my own limited, very humble career as a state legislator. And that is, I realize that the typical politician, such as a state legislator, never wants to lose one vote. Never wants to make anybody unhappy because they might vote against you or they might run against you in the next primary. Well, I discovered that in my very diverse district, where I had to come down on one side or another of issues that would be opposed by others in the district, that when I cast a vote, if I could explain myself and make the case as to why I'd voted that way, to convince certain people that at least I had thought about the issue, that I wasn't just reacting to it from an ideological knee-jerk point of view, that I would get a certain percentage of people who are willing to say, in so many words, well, I still disagree with him, but at least I give him credit for thinking this through,
Right.
or being judicious or fair or thoughtful. Now, that number was not 100%, but neither was it 0%. So from my humble experience, I think politicians should be bolder and realize that by doing things that aren't of their nature outrageous, like talking to somebody else, even on the other side of the political aisle, that they can do that and survive. Now, some may not survive, but the more who try it and realize that they can survive will encourage the others.
Uh, Weaponization, mechanization of institutions in Washington to go after political enemies. Are you concerned about that? Do you see Merrick Garland as exacting a retribution for the Judiciary Committee rejecting his nomination to the Supreme Court, and this is his way of getting back, or is this truly because most Republicans will say, okay, Trump had documents. It's not like he was selling them to China. And by the way, Pence had documents and Biden had documents. I mean, you've been in the White House. You've seen transitions. You know how chaotic, moving, And so, yes, you end up with 40 boxes that should have been at the National Archives, but they're at his house. And yes, he was bragging about it on tape, but I'm of the opinion it could have been resolved in another fashion other than sending the FBI in the cover of dark and then,
Well, that case will come up from what I have read, and that's the only thing I can say. I don't know for a fact, but from what I've read, that there were requests by the National Archives Administration to President Trump to give up these documents, requests that were pending for a year and a half before the agents pounded on the door. So it isn't like he wasn't given a chance. Now, why he kept them, we're told or we're led to believe that he'd like to have them as symbols of the important role that he once played.
Mementos.
He didn't have the White House anymore and didn't have Air Force One or Marine One or Camp David, but he had this document. To me, that seems very simplistic, but perhaps that was his motivation.
Perhaps.
And let me say that the whole use of the impeachment process is pure political theater.
Right.
Because the people who wrote our Constitution created, actually they continued, a British parliamentary ability to impeach public officials, but they created a Senate and gave the Senate a role and said you had to have 2/3 of the votes of the Senate in order to remove somebody. Well, we've had several impeachments at very high levels in the United States. One of President Andrew Johnson right after the Civil War, one of Bill Clinton, and two of Donald Trump. And none of those resulted in the removal of the president. Andrew Johnson came within one vote of being removed, but he was not removed. And the Clinton and Trump votes were very far away. Yeah. Why do it? Why go through all of that if it's going to end up in the acquittal of the person you're attempting? And the answer is they do it just for the here and now.
Showmanship.
Yes.
Showmanship.
To have a drama.
So the question again, you don't believe we're weaponizing, mechanizing the institutions in Washington to go after political enemies?
Well, let's think about the Justice Department. I have greater faith in the Justice Department, both ordinary day-to-day lawyers and the FBI, than Trump Republicans do. And that is a concern because I think those people are trying to do their job. I do not think that they are motivated by politics, but they have to make calls that have political effect. And that is the trouble that the department as a whole has found itself in. You recall that before the 2016 election, there was the issue of Hillary Clinton's emails. The FBI looked into it and said, from our study, Hillary Clinton did not violate the law. And then there was new evidence that came up, and the FBI director, Mr. Comey, said, well, we found some new evidence. We're going to reinvestigate Ms. Clinton. Well, she believes that was a contributing reason, if not the reason, that she was defeated for president just a few weeks later. So one way or the other, if you're going to deal with the question of whether Hillary Clinton legally used the email system properly, you're going to have to make a call. And in this case, the FBI made two calls that had political effect.
It seems to me. Well, go ahead, finish your thought.
And did they do it deliberately? No, I don't think they did it deliberately to either help Hillary Clinton in incident number one or hurt her in incident number two. But there was an issue, and they had to come down on it. Ditto Donald Trump's keeping classified documents. To me, that is either open and shut, prove it or don't prove it case. Either he had a piece of paper that showed that he had legitimate ability to declassify those documents and take them with him to Florida, or he didn't. He can't do it after he's president. He could only do it during his presidency. That's up to the Justice Department to prove. And if he's guilty as charged, which I'm, because we believe in people being innocent until proven guilty, so I'm not presuming guilt. But if the allegation is correct, then it was the duty of the FBI, meaning the Justice Department, to go enforce the request of the National Archives Administration and retrieve those documents.
It seems to me that everything in Washington is so politicized. You know, a virus and COVID-19. You know, poor Anthony Fauci just couldn't do anything right, so it just seems everything is so politicized.
Well, as I say, there are certain actions that you have to take that have a political effect.
Right.
No doubt about that. But whether you have a political intent is the issue.
Yeah.
I mean, take redistricting, and that is always a controversial issue, particularly at the congressional level. If you have to divide a state like Texas into 38 districts, then yes, there will be political considerations aplenty. It doesn't matter who is in charge, be it Democrats or Republicans, they're going to want to create those districts to their advantage.
Correct.
That's their intent. But you can't do something like that without having some kind of effect. Suppose instead of creating 38 districts, you only had to create 2 districts, and you have this jurisdiction. Maybe as a city, maybe it's a county. You have to create 2 districts. Well, where do you draw the line? Well, you can draw the line any way you want. There will be a political effect.
Yeah.
And the loser is going to say that you had the intent to get at them, even though it was a simple matter of drawing one line through one box.
So, certainly you have a wider and deeper involvement in politics than I do. I'm sort of a newbie compared to you. Not saying that you're older. You've just been doing it longer.
That too, yes.
But collectively, I think we have 50 years in politics. So to conclude, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Because I do believe in reading history, I am an optimist because I have seen in the pages of American history, the United States get through far worse times than we are experiencing today.
I agree.
The pre-Civil War period, the post-Civil War period, the
Civil rights period,
the Civil Rights Movement, the 1960s, which some of my contemporaries somehow think of nostalgically, were a terrible time for the United States with burning cities.
Burning cities, civil rights, assassinations.
All those things occurred in the 60s,
and then nuclear proliferation in Cuba and the missile crises. Yeah.
So we got through all that.
Yeah.
Now, do I believe everything about modern society, including its politics, is ideal and perfect? No. But it is the American genius, going back to the founding of this country, going back to the colonial period, always to keep improving and to keep looking at ourselves, which is to say, having fights over how to improve and whether to improve, and that remains a constant. So that's why I'm an optimist, although I will not be around long enough to see my optimism validated. And 50 years from now, there will be controversies that divide the United States, maybe controversies we don't even know about today.
You remind me of an interview I watched with Charles Barkley, and he was reflecting on life. He says, life is like a game of golf. He says, I'm on the back nine. I don't know if I'm on the 17th hole or the 11th hole, but I know I'm on the back nine. So, yes, I too am optimistic. I know we have a lot of issues, and, my job, of course, through Texas Latino Conservatives is continue to expand the party, to bring more people into the conservative movement and to recognize that free markets and the rule of law and our Constitution continue to be one of the greatest combinations in the history of the world, that all people, I think even immigrants that come here illegally, have an opportunity to be part and parcel of the American fabric, create businesses, educate their children. I'm always impressed when I got to tell you a story. Back in the 80s, I drove an old beat-up BMW, and it was always in the shop. And so I couldn't go to the BMW dealership. They were expensive. So I found this guy named Julian Martinez, who owned a company called Beamer Auto Repair and Sales off of Richmond and Janetta. And he's an immigrant, immigrated here from the Dominican Republic, moved to Houston in 1997, started fixing foreign cars for a guy named Enzo, an Italian. But in short order, Julian became his own owner and now has expanded to over 5.5 acres, has become a multimillionaire. His children have all graduated from Texas public universities. And the other day I found out he's running for mayor. Oh. Only in America. Yes. Only in America do immigrants like myself, like Mayra Flores, like Julian Martinez. We helped elect a young man from Jamaica to the State Board of Education. Only in America do immigrants actually have a chance to help run the government, because you can't go to Mexico City and run for city council. You can't go to Beijing. You can't go to Moscow, and you can't, you can't go to Baghdad. Only in America, and so it continues to be the greatest country. I'm optimistic, Ambassador. It's always a pleasure to have you. We could talk for another hour and a half.
Easily.
But it's almost noon, and I know you're getting hungry, and I promised you a lunch. So
very important.
Let's shut this program down. We have been visiting with Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, a dear friend, a great historian, a great patriot who generously donates his time every time we ask him to be on the program. His website is?
Untermeyer.com.
Untermeyer.com. Read his books, follow him. He's very involved, very active still in our community and around the country. Texas Latino Conservatives is a volunteer organization. We rely on the generosity of Texans to help us keep this program going, and the multiplicity of programs that you see at the top of there, which is Texas Latino Conservatives Pastors and Leadership Latino. We operate a general purpose PAC in the state of Texas where we help elect conservatives, and we have a nonprofit organization where we train. This photo that you're seeing now is our last class about 2 weekends ago of Leadership Latino. Many of these candidates will run for public office. Some will be elected. But the good news is that they're all working hard in their communities to spread the message of conservatism, opportunity, and hope in our state and in America. So if you can help us out, make a contribution, TexasLatinoConservatives.com. We'll see you guys next week when Andrea Gomez will be back from her assignment. Thank you and God bless.